The stranger arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the last well went dry. Nobody saw him ride in. One moment the dusty stretch of road that cut through Ember Flats was empty, shimmering in the midday heat like a mirage. The next, he was standing in front of the saloon, his horse tethered to a post that hadn't seen use in months. The animal was gaunt, ribs visible beneath a coat dulled by travel, but its eyes were clear, alert. The man himself was tall, lean in the way that spoke of hunger more than build. His coat was the colour of old blood, worn at the seams, and his hat brim shadowed a face that might have been 30 or 50. Hard to tell with the dust and the stillness he carried. He didn't look around, didn't survey the town like most travellers did, weighing whether it was worth stopping or worth forgetting. He just stood there. Inside the saloon, Martha Curran wiped down the bar for the 3rd time that hour, though no one had touched it. The wood was scarred and sun-bleached, the kind of surface that had absorbed 1,000 conversations and twice as many regrets. She glanced toward the window, squinting against the light, and froze. "Someone's outside," she said. Her husband, Tom, looked up from the ledger he'd been staring at for the better part of an hour. Numbers didn't lie, and the numbers said they had 2 weeks left. Maybe 3 if they rationed the grain and stopped feeding the chickens entirely. He rose slowly, joints complaining, and moved to the window. "Don't recognize him," Tom muttered. "Nobody comes here anymore," Martha replied quietly. "Not unless they're lost." Tom didn't answer. He watched the stranger, who still hadn't moved, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly. More like the awareness that whatever came next wouldn't be ordinary. The stranger finally moved. He stepped onto the boardwalk, boots making soft, deliberate sounds against the warped wood, and pushed open the saloon door. The hinges creaked. The sound filled the empty room like a gunshot. He stopped just inside the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Then he looked at Tom, then at Martha, and something in his expression shifted. Softened, maybe, or just recognized something familiar. "Water," he said. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in days. Martha moved without thinking, reaching for the pitcher they kept behind the bar. It was half full, murky from sitting too long, but it was all they had. She poured it into a tin cup and slid it across the bar. The stranger picked it up, drank deeply, and set it down with a soft clink. "Thank you," he said. Tom stepped forward, arms crossed. "You got a name?" The stranger hesitated, not like he was deciding whether to lie, more like he was deciding whether the name mattered anymore. "Caleb," he said finally. "Caleb what?" "Just Caleb." Tom nodded slowly. He'd known men like this before, men who'd left their last names behind along with whatever they were running from. He didn't press. "Where you headed?" Tom asked. Caleb glanced toward the window, toward the town beyond. From where he stood, you could see most of Ember Flats, or what was left of it. The general store with its door hanging loose, the church with half its roof caved in, the rows of houses, some still occupied, most empty, their windows dark and lifeless. "Nowhere in particular," Caleb said. Martha exchanged a glance with Tom. It was the kind of look that carried a conversation they didn't need to speak aloud. "Ain't much here," Tom said carefully. "Town's dying. Has been for a year now." Caleb didn't seem surprised. What happened? Drought, Martha said. Wells dried up one by one, crops failed, folks started leaving last spring. Now there's maybe 20 of us left. She paused, wiping her hands on her apron, though they were already clean. We're hanging on, barely. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Tom. You got any work? Tom blinked. Work? I can dig, build, fix things. Caleb's gaze was steady. In exchange for a place to sleep and whatever food you can spare. Tom opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at Martha again, and this time her expression was unreadable. We don't have much to pay with, Tom said slowly. Didn't ask for pay. There was something in the way Caleb said it, simple, matter of fact, that made Tom pause. He'd met drifters before, men looking for a free meal and a warm bed before moving on, but this felt different. This felt like someone who needed a reason to stay, even if just for a little while. There's a room upstairs, Martha said before Tom could answer. Hasn't been used in months, but it's dry. Caleb nodded once. That'll do. Tom studied him for a beat longer, then sighed. All right, but if you're staying, you work. We got fences that need mending, a roof on the church that's half gone, and a well that might still have water if someone digs deep enough. I'll start tomorrow, Caleb said. He finished the water, set the cup down gently, and turned toward the stairs. He moved like a man who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, and when he disappeared into the shadows of the second floor, the room felt strangely larger without him. Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You think he's running from something? She asked quietly. Tom didn't answer right away. He walked back to the window and looked out at the empty street, at the dust devils spinning lazily in the heat. Everyone who ends up here is running from something, he said finally. Caleb didn't come back downstairs that evening. Martha left a plate of beans and cornbread outside his door, and when she checked an hour later, the plate was empty. That night, Tom lay awake beside Martha, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of old wood settling and the whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls. You think he'll actually stay? Martha whispered. Tom didn't know, but something about the stranger, the way he'd stood in the road like he'd been waiting for permission to stop moving, made him think, maybe, just maybe, this one would. We'll find out tomorrow, Tom said. And in the room upstairs, Caleb sat on the edge of a narrow bed, staring at his hands in the dark. Hands that had built things once, hands that had broken things too. He didn't sleep. He never did any more. Caleb was already at work when Tom came outside the next morning. The sun hadn't fully crested the horizon yet, the sky still bruised with shades of purple and grey, but Caleb was crouched beside the old well in the centre of town, pulling up lengths of rotted rope. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his hands already dirt-stained, and he worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of someone who didn't need to be told what to do. Tom stopped a few paces away, coffee mug in hand, and watched. After a moment, Caleb glanced up. "Rope's no good," he said. "Bucket's gone too, but the well's deeper than I thought. Might be water down there still." Tom took a sip of his coffee, bitter and weak. "You sure you want to waste your time on that? Last 3 men who tried said it was bone dry." Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. Then they didn't dig deep enough. There was no arrogance in his voice. Just certainty. Tom found himself nodding despite himself. "All right," Tom said. "I'll see if I can find some rope that's still got life in it." By midday, word had spread. Ember Flats was small enough that any change, no matter how minor, rippled through the remaining families like a stone dropped in still water. By the time the sun was high, a small crowd had gathered near the well. Not everyone. Just enough to make it feel like something was happening. There was Mary Hollis, who ran the boarding house with her 2 children, Jacob Stern, the blacksmith who hadn't had work in months, old Samuel Greaves, who'd lived in Ember Flats longer than anyone could remember, and refused to leave even when his children begged him to, and a handful of others, worn thin by heat and hunger and the slow erosion of hope. They stood in the shade of the general store's awning watching Caleb work. He'd fashioned a new rope from what scraps Tom had found, tied it to a bucket he'd patched with spare leather, and was lowering it into the well's dark throat. The crank groaned with each turn, rust flaking off in orange dust, but Caleb's hands moved steadily. "Think he'll find anything?" Mary asked quietly. "Doubt it," Jacob muttered. "We've tried everything." "He's not from here," Samuel said, voice thin as paper. "Maybe he sees something we don't." When the bucket hit bottom, Caleb paused. Then he began to pull. The rope went taut. The crank resisted. Caleb's jaw tightened, and he hauled harder, muscles straining beneath his coat. For a moment, nothing. Then slowly the bucket began to rise. The crowd leaned forward. Caleb pulled until the bucket cleared the well's stone rim, and when he tipped it, a thin stream of water splashed onto the ground, muddy, silty, but water. The crowd exhaled as one. "I'll be damned," Jacob breathed. Tom stepped forward, crouching beside the puddle. He dipped his fingers in, brought them to his lips, and tasted. His eyes widened. "It's good," he said, voice rough. "It's drinkable." For the first time in months, something like hope flickered through the small crowd. Mary Hollis pressed a hand to her mouth. Samuel closed his eyes. Even Jacob, who'd spent the better part of a year scowling at the world, allowed himself a faint, disbelieving smile. Caleb set the bucket down and wiped his hands. "It's not much," he said, "but if we ration it, it'll keep you going." "Keep us going," Martha corrected gently. Caleb didn't respond. He just nodded once and turned back toward the well. That evening, the mood in the saloon was different. Lighter, not joyful, survival didn't allow for that, but cautiously hopeful. Martha had cooked a small pot of stew, stretching what little they had, and for the first time in weeks the table was full. Caleb sat at the far end, quiet as always, eating slowly. The others talked around him, about repairs that needed doing, about whether the water would last, about what they might plant if the rains ever came again. And then Jacob asked the question, "Where'd you learn to find water like that?" The table went quiet. Caleb looked up, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, something old and heavy. "I worked a lot of places," he said carefully. "Doing what?" Jacob pressed. Tom shot him a warning look, but Jacob didn't back down. "Just curious. Man shows up out of nowhere, saves our well, seems fair to ask." Caleb set his spoon down. He didn't look angry, just tired. "I've done a lot of things," he said, "not all of them good." The silence stretched. "We all have," Samuel said softly. Caleb met the old man's eyes, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe. or just the recognition that judgment was a luxury none of them could afford. Martha cleared her throat. "More stew, anyone?" The moment broke, and conversation resumed, but Tom noticed the way Caleb's shoulders stayed tense for the rest of the meal. Later, after the others had gone home, Tom found Caleb outside, sitting on the saloon steps. The night was cool, the sky scattered with stars that seemed too bright for a world this dry. Tom sat down beside him. "You don't owe us your story," Tom said. Caleb didn't answer right away. "I killed a man once," he said finally. His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. He deserved it, but that didn't make it easier to live with. Tom was quiet. "I've been moving ever since," Caleb continued. "Trying to, I don't know, balance the scales maybe, do enough good that it evens out." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Doesn't work like that, though." "No," Tom agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a while. "You planning to leave?" Tom asked. Caleb looked out at the dark shapes of the town, at the houses clinging stubbornly to life. "Not yet," he said. And Tom didn't ask when. The riders came 3 days later. Caleb was repairing the church roof when he heard the hoofbeats, low and rhythmic, carrying across the flats like distant thunder. He paused, hammer in hand, and looked toward the horizon. 4 horses, 4 men, riding hard. He climbed down from the ladder slowly, his pulse steady but his instincts screaming. He'd learned a long time ago to trust that feeling. By the time the riders reached the town's edge, a small crowd had gathered in the street. Tom stood at the front, arms crossed, with Martha a step behind him. Jacob was there too, and Mary Hollis with her children pressed close to her sides. The riders slowed to a walk. Their horses were well-fed, well-groomed, expensive animals that didn't belong in a place like Ember Flats. The men themselves wore dusters and wide-brimmed hats, their faces hard and sun-beaten. The one in front had a badge pinned to his chest, tarnished and dull. "Afternoon," the man said. His voice was smooth, too smooth. "Name's Marshal Trent. These are my deputies." Tom nodded once. "What brings you out here, Marshal?" Trent smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you folks had some trouble. Thought we'd check in, make sure everything's lawful." "We're fine," Tom said evenly. "That so?" Trent's gaze swept over the gathered crowd, lingering on each face. Then it landed on Caleb, who stood slightly apart from the others, his expression unreadable. Trent's smile widened. "You look familiar, friend." Caleb didn't answer. "You from around here?" Trent pressed. "No," Caleb said. "Passing through?" "For now." Trent dismounted slowly, handing his reins to one of the deputies. He walked toward Caleb with the casual confidence of a man who knew he had the upper hand. "Funny thing," Trent said. "We've been tracking a man, dangerous fellow. Killed a rancher up north about 6 months back." He paused, studying Caleb's face. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" The air went cold. Tom stepped forward. "Marshal, if you've got business here, state it. Otherwise—" "Otherwise what?" Trent cut in, his tone still pleasant, but edged now with menace. "You'll ask me to leave? In case you forgot, friend, I'm the law out here." He turned back to Caleb. "So I'll ask again. You know anything about a man named Caleb Rain?" The name hung in the air like smoke. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "That rancher was beating his hired hands half to death. One of them was a boy, couldn't have been more than 15. Trent's smile vanished. "So you admit it?" I stopped him, Caleb said quietly. He came at me with a knife. It was him or me. Self-defense, Trent said, voice dripping with mockery. That's a good story. Too bad the law doesn't see it that way. Too bad the rancher's family put up a bounty. Tom's stomach dropped. Bounty? Trent looked at him, his expression cold now. $500, dead or alive. He glanced back at Caleb.
And I intend to collect. Martha stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. He's helped us, fixed our well. He's done nothing but good here. Don't care, Trent said flatly. Law's the law. Jacob spoke up, his voice rough. You're no lawman. You're a bounty hunter with a badge. Trent's hand drifted toward his gun. Careful, blacksmith. The street went silent. Caleb raised his hands slowly, palms out. I'll go with you, he said. No need for trouble. Caleb? Tom started. I said I'll go. Trent nodded, satisfied. He gestured to his deputies, who moved forward with rope. But as they reached for Caleb, Samuel stepped into their path. The old man was frail, his shoulders stooped with age, but he stood firm. You take him, Samuel said quietly, and this town dies. Trent laughed. Old man, get out of the way. No. And then Mary Hollis stepped forward, then Jacob, then Martha. One by one, the townspeople moved, forming a line between Caleb and the deputies. Trent's expression darkened. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Tom said, but he's one of us now. Trent's hand settled on his gun. You really want to do this? The street held its breath, and Caleb, standing behind the wall of bodies, felt something crack open inside him, something he thought had died a long time ago. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Trent's fingers hovered over his gun, his deputies flanking him with hands on their holsters.
The townspeople stood shoulder to shoulder, a fragile barricade of flesh and will, and in the space between them, the tension coiled tight enough to snap. Then Samuel spoke. You want him? The old man said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. You'll have to go through all of us. Trent's lip curled. You think I won't? I think, Tom said, stepping forward, that shooting unarmed townsfolk isn't something even a crooked marshal can explain away, badge or no badge. Trent's jaw worked. His eyes flicked over the crowd, counting, calculating. 4 guns against 20 people, most of them unarmed, true, but witnesses nonetheless. Word would spread. Questions would be asked. He spat into the dust. This ain't over! Figured as much, Tom said. Trent mounted his horse in one smooth motion, his deputies following suit. He looked down at Caleb, who stood silent and still behind the line of bodies. You got 1 week, Trent said. After that I'm coming back, and next time I won't ask nice. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it forward, the others following. Dust rose in their wake, and the thunder of hooves faded slowly into the distance. The street remained frozen for a long moment. Then, one by one, the townspeople began to exhale. Mary Hollis turned to Caleb, her eyes bright with something fierce. Don't you dare run! Caleb stared at her, stunned. You don't understand. We understand, Jacob cut in. You saved our well. You've been working yourself half to death for people you don't even know.
That counts for something. It doesn't erase what I did, Caleb said quietly. No, Samuel agreed. But it means something anyway. Caleb looked around at the faces surrounding him, worn, weathered, but alive with a defiance he hadn't expected. These weren't heroes, they were survivors, clinging to the last threads of a dying town. And yet they'd stood for him. He didn't know what to say. Martha solved the problem by stepping forward and gripping his arm. "Come on, we need to figure out what to do next." They gathered in the saloon as the sun dipped low, casting the room in shades of amber and shadow. Tom poured water into tin cups, precious now, rationed carefully, and set them on the table. "We can't fight them," Jacob said bluntly. "4 armed men against us. We'd be slaughtered." "So what do you suggest?" Mary asked. "We just hand him over?" "I didn't say that." "Then what?" "I don't know." Jacob slammed his hand on the table, frustration boiling over. "I don't know, all right, but we can't pretend this is something we can win." "We already won," Samuel said softly. Everyone turned to look at him. The old man took a slow sip of water, his hands trembling slightly. We stood up. For the first time in a year, we didn't just roll over and accept what we were given. That's worth something. "That's worth dying for," Jacob shot back. "Maybe," Samuel said, "if it means we die as people instead of ghosts." The room went quiet. Caleb finally spoke. "I'll leave." "No," Tom said immediately. "It's the only way." "No." Tom's voice was firm.
You leave, and we're right back where we started. A dying town full of people who've given up. You leave, and that marshal wins. Not just against you, against all of us. Caleb shook his head. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," Martha said. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She set it on the table. Caleb looked down. The photo showed a young man in uniform smiling at the camera. He had Martha's eyes. "Our son," she said quietly. "He died in the war, fought for something he believed in, even though he knew it might kill him." Her voice wavered, but didn't break. "I used to think that was foolish, that believing in something wasn't worth dying for. But now—" She looked at Caleb. "Now I think maybe it's the only thing worth dying for." Caleb's throat tightened. "We're not asking you to be a hero," Tom said. "We're asking you to let us be something other than victims." Caleb looked around the table, at faces lined with exhaustion and hope in equal measure, at people who had every reason to abandon him and chose not to. He thought about the man he'd killed, about the boy with the broken ribs and the haunted eyes, about all the miles he'd walked, trying to outrun a guilt that followed him like a shadow. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, standing still was the harder thing. "1 week," he said finally. "We have 1 week to figure out how to survive this." Tom nodded. "Then we better get to work." That night, Caleb couldn't sleep again. He stood at the window of his small room, looking out at the darkened town. Somewhere out there, Trent was planning his return. Somewhere out there, the clock was ticking. But for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel alone. And that, he realized, was more dangerous than any bounty hunter. Because now, he had something to lose. They spent the week preparing, not for war. They had no illusions about winning a gunfight, but for survival, for a plan that might, against all odds, give them a chance. Caleb worked alongside the townsfolk from dawn until dusk. They reinforced the saloon's walls with scrap lumber. They dug trenches along the main road, shallow, easy to miss in the dust, and filled them with sharpened stakes scavenged from old fences. Jacob repaired every tool that could double as a weapon: hammers, axes, pitchforks. Mary Hollis and the other women stockpiled water and food in the church, turning it into a fallback position. But the real work was quieter. Tom rode out to the neighbouring settlements, what few still existed, and returned with a handful of men. They weren't fighters, just ranchers and farmers who remembered what Ember Flats used to be and didn't want to see it erased entirely. They came with rifles, old but functional, and a grim willingness to stand. By the 6th day, the town had transformed, not into a fortress, it was still fragile, still dying, but into something that refused to go quietly. On the 7th day, Trent returned. He came at noon, when the sun was highest and the shadows shortest. 4 riders again, but this time they weren't alone. Trent had brought reinforcements, 6 more men, all armed, all hungry for the bounty. 10 against 20. Better odds than before, but still impossible. The riders stopped at the edge of town, just out of rifle range. Trent dismounted slowly and walked forward alone, hands held loosely at his sides. He stopped in the middle of the street, where the dust devils spun lazily in the heat. "Last chance," he called out. "Send out Caleb Rain, and we ride away. No one else has to die." Tom stepped out from the saloon, flanked by Jacob and Samuel. Behind them, the townspeople emerged from doorways and alleys, a ragged line of defiance. "He stays," Tom said. Trent sighed, almost theatrical. Stupid choice. He turned and walked back to his men. For a moment nothing happened. Then Trent raised his hand, and Caleb stepped into the street. The crowd gasped. Tom lunged forward, but Caleb held up a hand, stopping him. "Caleb, no," Martha started. "It's all right," Caleb said. His voice was calm, too calm. He walked toward Trent, each step deliberate, and stopped 10 paces away. "You want me?" Caleb said. "Take me, but you let 'em go." Trent smiled. "Now that's more like it." He gestured, and 2 of his men rode forward with rope. But as they dismounted, Caleb spoke again. "One condition." Trent raised an eyebrow. "You're not exactly in a position to negotiate." "Hear me out," Caleb said. "You take me in, you get your bounty, $500. But what happens after? You ride away, and these people are left with nothing."
No law, no protection, just waiting for the next man like you to come along. Not my problem. "It could be your opportunity," Caleb said. Trent paused. "I'm listening." Caleb nodded toward the well. "This town has water now, not much, but enough, and land, cheap land because everyone thinks it's worthless. But it's not if someone with resources knew how to use it." Trent's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying $500 is nothing," Caleb said. "But a town you could own, that you could rebuild and sell for 10 times that, that's something." The street went silent. Tom's eyes widened as he realized what Caleb was doing. Trent studied Caleb for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound.
"You're trying to con me." "I'm trying to give you a better deal," Caleb said. "You kill me. You get $500 and a lot of angry witnesses. You let me go, you get a stake in a town that could actually be worth something. And you get to be the man who saved it instead of the man who destroyed it." Trent's smile faded. He looked past Caleb at the townspeople, at the well, at the repaired buildings. He was calculating, weighing. "How do I know this place won't just die anyway?" Trent asked. "You don't," Caleb admitted. "But you're a gambling man, I can see it, and this is a better gamble than most." Trent was quiet for a long, agonizing moment. Then he spat into the dust again. "You're either the smartest man I've met or the dumbest." Caleb didn't answer. Trent turned to his men. "Mount up." One of the deputies looked confused. "Boss, the bounty—" "I said mount up." The men hesitated, then obeyed. Trent swung back onto his horse and looked down at Caleb. "I'll be back in 6 months," he said. "And if this town is still standing, maybe we'll talk business. If it's not—" He let the threat hang unspoken. Caleb nodded. Fair enough. Trent spurred his horse and the riders turned and rode away. Dust rose in their wake and the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tom let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. "Did that just work?" Jacob asked, dazed. "I think so," Martha whispered. Caleb turned back toward the town and the crowd rushed forward, voices overlapping in disbelief and relief. Samuel clapped him on the shoulder. Mary Hollis wiped tears from her eyes. Even Jacob, gruff as he was, allowed himself a faint smile. But Tom pulled Caleb aside, his expression serious. "You just bet this town's future on a bluff," Tom said quietly. "I know," Caleb replied. "What if Trent comes back and we're still dying?" Caleb looked at him, and for the first time, something like hope flickered in his eyes. "Then we make sure we're not." 6 months later. The town wasn't thriving, not yet, but it was alive. The well had held deeper than anyone expected, and with careful rationing, it sustained them through the worst of the heat. They'd planted crops, small experimental plots that drank the meager water and somehow grew. Not much, but enough. Word had spread slowly that Ember Flats wasn't dead. A few families drifted back. A traveling merchant stopped and decided to stay. The church roof was finished, the saloon had customers again, and Caleb was still there. He'd built a small house on the edge of town, modest and plain, but his. He worked the land alongside the others, and in the evenings he sat on the saloon steps and watched the sun set over the flats. Tom joined him one evening, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Caleb, who took it with a nod of thanks. "Trent's coming back next week," Tom said. Caleb nodded. "I know. You think he'll keep his word?" "I think he'll see that we're still standing," Caleb said, "and that's enough." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to deep indigo. "You ever think about leaving?" Tom asked. Caleb considered the question. Once, the answer would have been automatic. Yes. Always yes, but now? "No," he said quietly. "I don't." Tom smiled. "Good." He stood, clapped Caleb on the shoulder, and headed back inside. Caleb remained on the steps, the warm cup cradled in his hands, and looked out at the town. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for a man who'd spent years running from himself, something was enough. Years later, the story would be told differently. They'd say a stranger came to Ember Flats on the day the last well went dry, and with nothing but his hands and his will, he brought the town back from the edge. They'd say he faced down a crooked marshal and won with words instead of bullets. They'd say he stayed when he could have run, and that made all the difference. Most of it was true, but the part they'd never quite capture, the part that mattered most, was simpler than all that. A man who thought he was beyond saving found a town that needed saving, and in saving it he saved himself. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash. Caleb set down his empty cup, rose to his feet, and walked back inside. The door closed softly behind him, and in the quiet that followed, the wind whispered through the dusty streets of Ember Flats, a town that refused to die.